Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Jonathan Ruth here. I'm the Executive Director for Community Support Network, which is the association for New Hampshire's 10 area agencies. And welcome this afternoon to our webinar series. And we're really excited today to have Bonnie Dunham here from the Parent Information Center to talk about the special education process and people's rights under the special education laws. Before we launch into our presentation, I just want to point out a few features of the Zoom webinar platform that we're using today. For those of you who are new to it, you have logged in and been muted when you sign on to the webinar, and that allows our presentation to continue without a variety of interruption, but we really are interested in your questions. And so the best way to do that is to use the Q&A feature on Zoom. And so if you have your mouse or using a touchpad and move your cursor around, the little Zoom menu will pop up and you'll see a button that says Q&A. So if you click on that button, it will allow you to type in a question and hit submit. And we'll be monitoring the questions here so that we can try to answer them during the presentation, and certainly we'll leave time at the end of the presentation for any questions we didn't get to. So again, please use that Q&A feature to submit your questions, and we'll try to get them all answered for you before the end today. The second thing I wanted to mention is that your feedback is really important to us, so we will be sending out a survey link shortly after the webinar, probably within the next day or so. And we'd really love for your feedback on today's presentation or other topic ideas that you have that you'd like to see us cover in our webinar series here. So please look for an email from Heather Young here at CSNI and give us the feedback that will be helping us to improve our webinar series overall. So again, thank you all for joining us, and I'm really happy to introduce Bonnie Dunham, who is the Special Education Law and Policy Specialist for the Parent Information Center here in Concord. And Bonnie, welcome. This is a great topic for us to be covering, and certainly at the start of the legislative session, an important one for people to be aware of, so that as special education laws are being looked at or amended or proposed for changes, folks can be aware of that. But this is a great way for folks who are either new to special education or who have children, who are in early intervention services and need to know what special education is going to be about, or those who are in the process of transitioning out into adult services. So a lot of ground to cover, I'm sure, but we're really grateful to have you here.
If you are fairly familiar with this process, a review is never harmful. It always is good to just give a quick look through right before you have an important meeting coming up so that you feel completely comfortable and confident. So I'm Bonnie Dunham, and I'm with the Parent Information Center. And on the first slide, you'll see that we have a website listed there. And if you go to that website, you can find lots of materials and resources, tools, an overview of the process that gives a little bit more detail, and also a calendar of upcoming workshops that will range anywhere from 1 hour to 6 hours to 10 weeks. And so whatever best fits your needs and your level of interest, please, we welcome you to come to any of those sessions, and also to give us feedback. That's always helpful. Oops. So Parent Information Center has as its goal to prepare people to become their own effective self-advocates. And so we don't speak for people. We're not attorneys. We don't give legal advice, but we try to give information and resources so that people can make informed decisions. Whatever decision you think is best for your family is great, but it should be one that you make based on good and complete information. That's our goal. So the first thing that you'll recognize from this slide is that the special education law and process is like alphabet soup. This slide says state and federal special education laws ensure that a FAPE in the LRE in accordance with the child's IEP is made available to all eligible children with a disability. One of the handouts that you have is our Steps in the Special Education Process brochure. And in that, there is a little summary of some of the key acronyms that you're likely to hear when you participate in this process. But this one is a free, appropriate public education. Public education is free for children with and without disabilities. And it needs to be appropriate to enable the child to make meaningful progress. And so for each child with a disability, what is appropriate may be a little bit different depending on that child's abilities, interests, age, and so on. The least restrictive environment, the quickest way to describe that is the most typical educational setting that can meet that child's needs. So it has to be a place that can give the child whatever the IEP says the child needs, but with as much opportunity to participate in the general education curriculum and interact with peers without disabilities as possible. And in accordance with that individualized education program, which is the document that is completed every year with parents and educators and others working together to identify the child's needs and to make a plan to meet them. And that document is the one that describes all of the services that the child will receive and how you'll know whether or not what you're doing is working or not. We'll talk more about that a little bit later on. And everyone who's eligible for special education will have an IEP. There may be children who have a disability but don't need special education. So you may hear about some kids who have a 504 plan. That's a child who needs some accommodations, some modifications, but they don't really need special education. And then some children have a disability and they don't need any services at all in terms of being able to access the general curriculum. And so it's not that it's an automatic if a person has a disability that they will be receiving special education. Oops. So one of the resource guides that we have that we think is most helpful to families is our Steps in the New Hampshire Special Education Process brochure. It's about 18 pages long, which seems a little bit long until you think of it as a summary of the 250-page special education regulations, puts things in perspective a bit. And because when you look at the overall law and process, it can be scary. The special education process, we like to frame it in terms of individual steps. And for each step that you go through to determine eligibility and then obtain appropriate services and monitor, there are a few key things that people need to know about. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So the first thing that happens is that somebody suspects a child has a disability. And if you have a child who has a developmental disability, you may have already been involved in early supports and services. Family-centered early supports and services or early intervention is for children from birth up until their 3rd birthday. And if your child is receiving early intervention services or there's an automatic process to help them to transition into the next step, whether that be typical preschool or into some special education services upon their 3rd birthday. But at other times, a family may have a child and become aware over time that this child seems to be learning in a different way or struggling with some aspects of development. And then that family may make their own referral to that school district asking for their child to be considered for special education. The referral is then received by the school district, and if appropriate, evaluations are done. Those evaluations are used to determine eligibility. Does the child have a disability? Does the child need special education? And then if the child is found eligible, a team will develop an individualized education program or IEP for the child and decide what setting, what educational placement is appropriate to meet that child's needs. And then you monitor to find out, is what we're doing working, or do we need to make a course correction? That's one of the really nice things about this process, is that if you find yourself doing something that's not working as well as you had hoped, then welcome to the real world. That happens to all of us all the time. You find out you did something that made perfect sense and it seemed like it would work just perfectly, and then something just didn't line up right. But through this process, you have the opportunity to schedule another meeting, get together and say, what do we need to do to change this so that it does better meet this child's needs? And at least annually, there's a formal meeting to restart that process and again, look at the child's needs and develop a new IEP. But at any time during the year, you can also have a meeting to make some adjustments when appropriate.
I think that's a really, really important point to take home, because I think sometimes when you're getting ready for that first IEP, it's anxiety provoking, or you really you're putting a lot of hope into that first plan. And the fact that you've got to understand that it's a marathon, not a sprint, and you've got to not every mile is going to be run at the same pace.
And people sometimes get really anxious about, what if I make a mistake? And to make people feel more comfortable, I always think of it as, don't worry about that, because you will. Everybody makes a mistake. If you think back at any point in your life, and at that point you knew then what you know now, you would probably have done things a little bit differently. And that's the same thing that happens in this process. You make the best decision that you can, knowing what you know at the time, having an understanding of your child's needs at that point in time. And then as time goes on, you make some changes. And you're not making those changes and those decisions by yourself. That's also a nice thing, is that there's a team of people who bring a variety of perspectives and experiences and areas of expertise to that table. And so you can rely on each other to provide that whole picture of this child and his or her needs, and some ideas and strategies to meet those needs. Parents are a key member of that IEP team, that team that not only develops the IEP, but also makes all of the other major decisions that are part of the special education process. If a child doesn't have a parent, they may be in foster care or in some other way their parental rights have been removed, then that child likely has a legal guardian. And if they don't, an educational surrogate parent will be appointed by the Department of Education to represent that child just in the special education process. So at every meeting, every child has a right to have somebody representing the parent perspective there. The student is invited when it's appropriate, and the person who decides when it's appropriate is the parent. And it's not all or nothing. When children reach the age of 14, then the school district must invite them to the meeting, because you're talking about preparing that child for that child's adult life. And so their input certainly needs to be considered. But for some children, their level of anxiety may be so intense that the parent is concerned that it would be too overwhelming. And so that parent may say, I would like my child just to come for part of the meeting, or could we meet with a small group of us ahead of time and get the child's input? Most often the child will at that age begin to participate in the meetings, but there are also opportunities to manipulate that a little bit so that the child's able to provide input in a way that's not overwhelming. And also, you don't have to wait until age 14. I have a child with a disability, he's grown up now, who went to all of his IEP team meetings starting at age 3. Didn't stay for the whole hour meeting though. He came for just a couple of minutes so that we could get some input. Some people have children come at the very beginning of the meeting to say, so this is what we're going to talk about. Is there anything you'd like us to think about? Others may have a child come towards the end of the meeting to say, here's what we decided. Do you have any questions? Do you think that makes sense? Do you have anything else you want us to think about? And then other children are able to stay for the entire meeting. It depends on whatever works best for you. There also has to be at least one of your child's regular education teachers, that general ed teacher, and at least one special ed teacher or service provider of that child. And so it's somebody who knows that child, who can bring that perspective to the table. Sometimes a child may have a disability like a speech and language impairment, where the speech and language pathologist may be the key person in that child's education, and they may represent that special ed perspective instead of the special ed teacher. At other times, you may have both of them there. And so this is the absolute minimum people who can be there. The representative of the local education agency, that's another acronym. And so you'll hear LEA rep quite often, and that just means it's a representative of the school district. The local education agency is the school district. And that's the person who oversees or supervises special education, is knowledgeable about the general curriculum for children of that age, and knowledgeable about the resources of the school district. So they will know, do we need to bring in some additional resources to meet this child's needs? When they're there, then they also are able to commit resources for the district. And so at no point should a team make decisions and then the parent be told, well, now we're going to take that input and run it by the special education director. That person who can give that decision needs to be at that meeting. And then someone who can interpret, what do these evaluations mean in real life? What do they mean in terms of, does the child need some accommodations or some special strategies in reading class, for example? And so that may not be a whole new person. It may be the representative of the local education agency. It may be the regular ed teacher or the special ed teacher. But someone needs to be there who can make sense of the evaluations when you're thinking about it in an educational way. And when a child gets older, sometimes the team is thinking about vocational education opportunities, or having a child participate in a career and technical education program, because children with and without disabilities have the same right to apply to a career and technical education program. But when that decision is being made, you're having people think about a program that they may not be as familiar with. And so someone who knows about that program needs to be at the meeting so they can help others at the table understand what that program offers and how it works. And then the parent or the school district can invite someone else to the meeting who has special knowledge or expertise about the child. Sometimes a parent will bring a friend, a child care provider, 4-H leader who works with their child, who can, or even a professional who works with their child, who can bring that input to the team to help them to understand this child's needs. If a child is involved in the juvenile justice system or the court system, then a representative from DCYF or a guardian ad litem will be invited. School district may invite a behavior specialist if that's an area of challenge for the child, or someone like that. But it needs to be someone who has special knowledge or expertise about the child. It's not someone who says, I'd like to sit in on an IEP team meeting because I've never seen what they're like. That's not the place for that to happen.
Tony, one of the questions that comes up from time to time is, particularly for students who are transitioning, who are starting a transition to adulthood, is it appropriate for an area agency transition coordinator to be invited to help sort of learn about the plan and start to be able to carry it forward?
Absolutely. As children get older, sometimes you'll have a representative from vocational rehabilitation attend. Sometimes you'll have someone from an area agency attend who specializes in transition. For children with mental health issues, there may be somebody representing the community mental health center who is involved with a child who could attend. And sometimes a child, especially as they get older, may invite a peer to come with them, one of their classmates who may really know that child, and together they can better perhaps express what that child's needs and interests are. And so it's a pretty open option, and really think about what makes sense for your child. A few extra players that come to the table at certain times are when children are transitioning from early supports and services. So they're approaching age 3. There is a process for that transition to occur, but a representative from that early intervention or ESS program will be invited to participate in the meeting. And that's almost a bridge between the early intervention program in the school district and someone who has known the child for a while, as the child was getting services as an infant and toddler, and then helping the school district know the child and prepare them for a more academic focused or developmental focus program. And then when students are suspected of having a learning disability may affect a child in the area of reading or math or writing or expression. And so someone to conduct whatever kinds of diagnostic evals are appropriate for that particular child. And then when you're considering transition from high school, which is always an area where people can have some anxiety, you may finally feel like, I know how this process works, and now you're going through a door and learning about another whole process. It's exciting and scary all at the same time. But when that transition is being discussed, which begins at age 14 in New Hampshire, then the student is invited to the meeting, and there may be representatives from adult service agencies who are invited, like Voc Rehab or an area agency, but written consent from the parent or the student if they're an adult, meaning 18 or older, needs to be obtained, because merely by inviting them, you're divulging that this child has a disability, which is private information. And if a parent enrolls a child in a chartered public school or a charter school, children with disabilities have the same right to attend a charter school as a child without a disability. And just as for a child without a disability, it's a parent's choice, only a parent's choice, not an IEP team or a school district's choice. Then there's a process for that to happen, and that involves somebody from the charter school also participating in the meeting. There may be a time when a member of the team can't be there. For example, the general ed teacher may have had surgery for a gallbladder operation and is going to be out for a week, and you may decide that you don't want to wait a week for this meeting. It's a meeting that's been scheduled and you think it's important to have it anyway. In that case, the parent and the school district can mutually agree to excuse that person from all or part of the meeting. But if their area of expertise is going to be discussed at that table, at that meeting, then in addition to getting that written excusal, the individual who's being excused needs to provide written input to the parent and other members of the team ahead of time, so that you're getting that input before you actually get into the meeting. Because parental involvement is so important, when you think about your child, there are things you know about your child that nobody else does. I one time had, started to doubt myself, and I calculated how many hours in my 3-year-old's life had I known him. The number was tremendous, and I just felt like, wow, I must know things about him that the people at this table who give him a half-hour speech a week just don't. They have valued expertise and information that I sure didn't have, but I knew my child best, and so the parent's role is really important. And to make it possible for you to participate in meetings, the school district needs to provide advance notice. 10 days is traditional for an IEP team meeting, but there are exceptions. If it's a meeting to determine if a behavior that is going to result in a significant suspension is caused by the disability, that's called a manifestation determination meeting, and you get 5 days notice. And a parent can also waive that 10 days notice if you all think it's really important to meet sooner, and you'll be asked to sign a form waiving that. Parents can also request a team meeting. Something new might come up, or you're concerned about a child's lack of progress, or about some challenges in a different area that you're starting to see. And so you can request an IEP team meeting, and when a parent does that, it's always a best practice to do it in writing. At the Parent Information Center, we think it's a best practice to do everything in writing, because it eliminates the likelihood of people misunderstanding what you're asking for. And we have sample letters on our website to make it easier for that to happen. And if a parent requests a meeting, the meeting needs to be held within 21 calendar days, or the parent needs to get a written notice from the school, a written prior notice explaining why the school is refusing to meet. It has to be a really good reason. If a parent can't be at a meeting, perhaps you have a job that's an hour away and you just can't travel to the meeting in the middle of the day, but you still want to participate, then you can ask to participate through alternate means like conference call or Skype, almost like this Zoom meeting that we're having right now, so that you can still participate without actually having to be physically present in the room where the meeting is being held. A new piece of New Hampshire special education regulations are that it's something intended to help parents feel as prepared as others at the meeting. And so before you have a meeting, parents will be sent copies of all of the evaluation and assessment reports that are going to be used at that meeting to make decisions. And you'll be sent those at least 5 days before the meeting. So you have a chance to sort of review them. You might have questions, you can jot them down. And so then you're prepared as soon as you get there to get those questions answered, and then to use the information you have to participate in that process. And also parental consent is required throughout the process. At every step in the process, there are decisions that are made. And in New Hampshire, we require written parental consent at every single one of those steps, which is not the case in every state, but New Hampshire really values parental input very highly. That written prior notice that I just mentioned is the document that happens after a team makes a decision. So for example, the team developed an IEP and it's given to the parent. That's a proposal. Sometimes the parent may make a request and this team may say, we're not going to, for example, increase the speech therapy to 5 days a week. That's a refusal. So the written prior notice explains the decision that was made. It tells what that decision was, the reasons why that decision was made. It needs to list every document, record, report, evaluation, assessment that was used in making that decision, any other options that were considered and why they were rejected, and any other factors that were used in making the decision. And also it has to note that a parent, if appropriate, was given a copy of their rights, or if you'd already gotten one that year, that you were informed that you could ask for another copy. And whenever parental consent is requested, at every step in that process, when you get a document asking for your written consent, you have 3 choices. You can agree, yep, I agree with that IEP that I've been given, and so you would then sign, I give consent. I refuse consent. I don't like this IEP at all. I'm refusing consent. Or you may give partial consent. I like everything in the IEP except you're providing counseling through the school counselor, and my child gets counseling outside of the school district. I'd rather not have it happen in school. And so you would then specify what you are either refusing or what you would like added or changed. And then you can, if you're refusing something, it just goes away. It doesn't happen. But if you're asking for something to be added or changed, you would ask to have another meeting scheduled to talk about just that one issue. And it gives you and the others on the team that one extra opportunity to try to resolve that disagreement. So the first step in the process is somebody suspects that a child has a disability and they make a referral to the school district to have the child evaluated to find out, does the child need special education? And the first step is for that IEP team, including the parent, to meet within 15 business days and decide, is there really any reason on earth to think this child might need special education? Or is the issue the parent is raising concerns about one that could be met using general education interventions? If there's a reason to suspect there might be a disability, then the school district would propose certain evaluations to be done. Parent participates in that discussion, and the parent is then asked to give written consent for those evaluations to be done. Because through this process, you want to make decisions based on data, on really firm documents, not just on your memory. You don't want to rely on that if you can avoid it. Having well-organized records is a helpful strategy, and in your handouts, I've included a format that you might use to organize your school records. Also included a little tip sheet on effective communication, because at meetings you've got a lot of different people with different personalities and styles. Conflict is natural, and there are just some basic strategies that you can use to make that less likely.
And Bonnie, just to because you referenced the handouts, if anybody registered after or late, just within the last couple of hours before we started, we will send those handouts to you. Anybody who had registered before that got an email with attachments that included those handouts.
Right. Yeah. And in the handouts, in the margin where you would typically take notes, there are some notes that I've already pre-included that will tell you what page in the steps in the special education process brochure you can find more information about each piece of this workshop. At each step in the process, I've included a slide that gives you some ideas for things you might want to bring to that meeting or use to prepare for that meeting. And so there's a list here for that. And one is a chronological history of your child's development and school experiences. That's really helpful because you may find that some well-intended people make some suggestions based on their knowledge and their experiences. And by having that chronological history, you can say, we tried that 2 years ago and either it worked really well or it didn't, or we had to modify it in some way, shape, or form. And sometimes at a meeting, you'll end up saying, let's schedule another meeting we didn't quite finish. And you don't want to have your calendar sitting at home when that happens, and then you have to play phone tag back and forth to try to schedule that meeting. Bring your calendar, bring a pen and paper, and you'll just feel much more comfortable. The next step, if the team decides to evaluate the child because there is a reason to believe there could be a disability, then those evaluations will find out for sure, determine for sure, does the child need special education? And also the evaluations identify all of the educational needs. And any evaluation that is required by the team is provided at no cost to the parent. Medicaid to schools funding may be used to pay for some parts of some of these things, but in no case can a parent be told, we need to get input from your physician as part of this process, and so could you take your child to the doctor and bring us the results? If that is said, then the next sentence out of the schools should be, and we will tell you where to have the physician bill us, because it's not something that should cost the parent something. And parental consent is required for any evaluation. Usually when a parent gets the evaluations from the school district, that report, which again, you'll get a couple of days, 5 days ahead of the meeting, or it'll be sent 5 days ahead. You read those evaluation reports and find out, well, that answers a question that I had. Well, that explains that concern that I've had about my child. But sometimes when you read the evaluations, it just doesn't describe your child, or you think something was missed or something was wrong. And in that case, there's a process where you can ask the school district to pay for a private evaluation. It's called an independent educational evaluation. Or you may even have some private evaluations that you've gotten on your own that you can bring and share with the team. And then because decisions are to be made based on accurate and up-to-date information, at least once every 3 years, children are reevaluated. But they also are reevaluated before a change in eligibility can be considered, or at any point when a parent or other member of the team thinks we need new information, we need more updated information to make decisions. When evaluations are being made, so a parent signs a form giving permission for testing to be done, and it will list what tests are going to be done, then the evaluation process has to be completed within 60 calendar days for that first evaluation. And that evaluation process is not just giving the tests, but also writing a report of the results, giving that report to the parent, and having a meeting to review them. All that needs to happen within 60 days of the date the school district receives the parent's written consent for the testing. The same 60-day timeline applies for reevaluations, those at least every 3-year reevaluations. But for reevaluations, the parent and the school district can agree to an extension of up to 30 days. When evaluating a child, you really want to know as much as possible to make good informed decisions. And so for every area that may affect the child related to the disability, evaluations could be done. And those include in the areas of health, hearing and vision, the child's social emotional status, which includes behavior sometimes, their intelligence status, academic and developmental performance, communication status. And remember, that can include not only how the child expresses himself, but also how he or she processes information that they're hearing, and then motor skills, daily living skills. For older kids, vocational skills may be assessed, and also consider, does the child need assistive technology? Because the evaluations are used to make all of the decisions from this point forward, for is the child eligible, what should be in their IEP, what educational placement is appropriate, you want to get the evaluations done right. You want to make sure that they really are appropriate. And for them to be appropriate, there's a whole list of requirements, and they're in the special steps in the special education process brochure. They have to assess the child's needs, what they can do now. They have to identify all of their needs, and that may include doing a functional behavioral assessment or a vocational evaluation. They have to reflect what the test measures, and that really means that if a child has a hearing impairment, and you are trying to measure how well they can perform in a certain academic area, you wouldn't give them a test where you're speaking the questions aloud to the child. You're not then really measuring that child's academic performance. You're confirming that they don't hear very well. And so when picking what tests are being done, make sure that the others on the team understand if there are some unique needs that your child experiences that may impact the ability for them to get good results out of certain types of testing. And you never use one test or strategy, always a variety of tools and strategies, and they need to be technically sound, reliable, and done by certified or licensed personnel. That means that they're trained and knowledgeable. And of course, the instructions are followed. And if a child is not an English speaker, if the English is not their first language, or if the child uses an alternate form of communication, that needs to be taken into consideration in making sure that the evaluation is one that's going to yield accurate information. When you go to the meeting to talk about evaluations, and you're going to get the school's evaluation results, and you'll get them ahead again, so you can review them ahead of time. Bringing information about work samples. When your child brings papers home, collect them, and so then you can date them if your child's too young to write their own date on the page, so that you can go in and perhaps you can show, here are some papers from the beginning of the year, and now it's January, and you could see that things have really deteriorated in terms of my child's handwriting abilities, and so that's why I'm asking for some extra occupational therapy. If you've gotten any outside evaluations or evaluations by your medical professional, bring that. If any previous testing was done, bring that. We have an evaluation summary form that's part of your handouts, and what that is just, it's a really simple form, but it can make evaluations sensible to families because they can seem overwhelming. And if as you look through it, whatever it says Bobby is good at, or a strength for Sally is, put that in one column, a need or a weakness or an area where he struggles, another column, and then recommendations. You can then rely on that when you're looking at the IEP that's being proposed, so you can see, are all of the needs being considered? Are they being addressed? Are the strengths being taken advantage of? And have we considered the recommendations? There's a thing called IEP Team meeting amnesia. It's not an actual diagnosis, but it's one that every parent I know has had. And so if you think that you have some questions and you're going to remember them when you get to the meeting, you're kidding yourself, because at some point in your child's life, you will likely have the experience of walking into a room and having your mind go blank. So write them down ahead of time. At that next meeting after the evaluation, and sometimes it may be at the same meeting if that's what you've agreed to, the team decides, is the child eligible for special education? Do they have a disability? And because of that disability, do they need special education? Does it affect their educational performance? And educational performance isn't just academics. Kids can be getting great grades, but if they are struggling socially, emotionally to such an extent that they can't participate in the educational experience, then they may need special education. And then there are a whole list of categories of disability, including intellectual disability, developmental disability for children up until age 10, developmental delay, orthopedic impairment, and so on. And so children will be classified into which category do they fall into, and that's for data collection purposes. Once that happens, the child has been found eligible, then the first meeting to write that IEP happens within 30 days. And then after that, at least once a year, the IEP is rewritten, it's revised. You all look at what worked, what didn't work, what are the, what issues are we seeing? Are we seeing any changes? And you use that information, and also sometimes new evaluations, and certainly input from their progress during this school year to make an IEP for the next year or the next 12-month period. And for any document, not just the IEP, but for any document that a parent is asked to give consent, which again could be I give consent, I refuse consent, or I give partial consent, you have 14 days to think about it. So that stress you might have at the meeting of, oh my God, I've gotten so much to think about, and now I need to decide right away. You don't. You can take that document home and think about it for 14 days. Just make sure you return it with either an I give consent, I refuse consent, or I give partial consent before that 14th day. And then once parents do sign the IEP, so the parents in the school have written that IEP and they both agree that it's appropriate, then everyone who will be implementing it, like the regular ed teacher and the special ed teacher, get a copy of it. When developing the IEP, one of the things that happens is that you want to make sure that whatever your child's strengths are, child is really good at
problem solving with peers, or they are really good at processing information that they hear orally. You want to take advantage of that so that you can capitalize on those strengths and helping them to make progress in other areas. So the team considers that, as well as considering the needs, of course, and the parents' concerns for their child's education. That's one thing you can think about ahead of time, because you know the school will ask you as you're writing that IEP together, what are your concerns for your child's education? And so think about that and come prepared with your answer, because that in writing that IEP, that's an area of focus that the team needs to emphasize when developing that IEP. And then for kids who have limited English proficiency, kids whose first language may not be English, or who are blind or visually impaired, or who need assistive technology, or who have either a hearing impairment or deafness or other communication needs, or who have behaviors that impede their learning or the learning of others, those are special factors that the team needs to consider and make sure those factors are addressed, as well as all of the child's disability-related needs in developing that IEP. Now, the IEP has a certain number of components
That have to be included when it's being developed. And the first is, and you'll remember this came from the evaluations, when the child is being evaluated, you looked at what can they do now? What are their present levels of academic achievement and functional performance? And now the IEP includes a statement to that effect. What can they do now? And then the team makes measurable annual goals for each area of need. So with special education services, with related services as appropriate, what can we reasonably expect this child to accomplish within the 12-month period that this IEP is being written for? And then in New Hampshire, for every child with a disability, unless the parents say we don't think we need it, that annual goal is broken down into benchmarks or short-term objectives. They're almost like points of measurement along the way, so that you don't have to think about it for a whole year. It's a way that can help families and school personnel as well sort of keep track of the child's progress in a way that's been predetermined, so that you know, are we making the progress that we expected, or do we need to look at making some changes in the IEP to better meet the child's needs? Because you want to know whether or not what you're doing is working, of course, the IEP will also state how are we going to measure the child's progress towards those annual goals, and how and when are parents going to be informed. And it's at least as often as parents are given report cards, so at least quarterly. And the statement also has to include, when the progress notice is being given, it has to state whether or not progress is sufficient to meet the goal by the end of the school year. So another way to know if you're on track, or if perhaps a course correction is necessary. The extent that children will not participate with non-disabled children in the regular classroom or program, it's written in an awkward way. And it's written that way because for many, many years, for generations, the expectation was that if a child had a disability, they would go someplace else. They wouldn't go to school with their brothers and sisters who did not have disabilities. That's changed. The expectation now is that all children have the right to go to school with children who don't have disabilities if their needs can be met in that setting with appropriate services. And because of that, with the default being the child will be in that general class or program, this component requires the team to explain any situations when the child would be pulled out of the regular class or program, or even for some children who may be spending the majority of their day in a different setting because of perhaps some very unique and highly challenging needs that child is experiencing. And then the IEP will list all of the special education, all of the related services and other supports that the child will receive. And what that IEP should include are all of the services that that child will need to advance towards the annual goals in the IEP, to make progress in the general curriculum, to participate in extracurricular and non-academic activities. Recess matters. If every child has is invited to participate in the French club in freshman year of high school, then a child with a disability has that same right. And if they need some related services or special ed to participate effectively, that's reasonable. And does that child need special ed related services and other supports to be educated in like in an inclusive setting with children with and without disabilities? Those are the services that should be included in that IEP. And then the IEP will also say, when are those services starting? When are they ending? how often will they take place, and where, and then who will be providing the services. And so it won't say Billy will get some speech. It will say Billy will get speech therapy for 1/2 hour twice a week in the general education classroom provided by the speech pathologist beginning September 1st, ending June 15th. And so really clear. Clarity is important. Most kids go to school 180 days a year for about 6.5 hours, but some kids, because of the type of disability that they experience, will not receive a free appropriate public education. They may even lose skills if they have that significant break, and so they may get services in the summer. They may get services during certain school vacations that are shorter, like the 2-week Christmas break or something, or they may even get an extended day. So anytime services are provided that are outside of the traditional school day or school year, that's considered to be an extended school year. And the Department of Education has a memo, and we have it on our website as well, that explains how that process works and what kinds of factors are considered in deciding what kids might need an extended school day or school year. Because all kids take statewide assessments, or because we want to measure how are kids with and without disabilities performing, to see if perhaps the school needs some additional assistance to meet the needs of a certain population. Some kids with a disability may need accommodations. Child's hand can't grasp a pencil or use his hand to type a keyboard independently. They may need accommodation, having somebody else do that for them, even though they're taking the instructions from the child about what the answer is. And so accommodations would be included in the IEP for those statewide assessments, or for a very small percentage of kids. 1% of kids may need an alternate assessment because that traditional statewide assessment couldn't really fairly measure their progress and their performance in a way. So there's an alternate assessment that can be used. I already mentioned the type of provider, whether it be a speech pathologist or a speech and language specialist who will be implementing the IEP, will be listed. And there's always a box where the school district signs saying, yes, we will be paying for these services. And then a place for the parent and the school district to sign, giving consent to the IEP. If you wonder, does the school district have to give my child what the IEP says that my child is supposed to receive? If it says they're supposed to receive occupational therapy twice a week, do they have to really give it to them? And yes, they do. The New Hampshire standards, which are our special education regulations, state the LEA shall provide the special ed related services, supplementary aids and services, accommodations and modifications to a child with a disability in accordance with the child's IEP. When kids get older, the IEP also includes a few extra things. The transition service needs, focusing on the courses of study. If the child, for example, wants to go to post-secondary education or wants to work in a particular field, are the courses of study, which can include classes or internships or even community-based experiences, leading to their being prepared for that future goal. And then when kids approach age 16, then the IEP will include specific measurable annual goals that are transition goals and the services that the child will need to reach those goals. And then because at 18, unless guardianship has been obtained over a child, the child becomes their own legal decision maker. The child is informed of that at least a year before they turn 18, so it's not a surprise. That could be a kind of scary surprise. When you're developing the IEP, bring a copy of your child's relevant school records. That IEP organizer that you have in your handouts is one way to do that. And any other work samples, any other information that you think will help to inform the teams making decisions for the IEP. And jot down your ideas for what should be included, what your areas of concern are, and so on for that. After the IEP is developed, after it's signed, sealed, and delivered is what I like to think of it as, then the parent and the school district, that team gets together and they say, now what is the least restrictive environment? The environment where the child will spend as much time as they can with kids without disabilities, but can still implement the IEP. What is that least restrictive environment? And so the team makes that decision. And it may be that the child is spending their day in the general ed classroom, which is where the majority of children spend their day. But a child might need to get some perhaps some individual intensive instruction in the area of reading or math. And so that the IEP would then say, except for 1 hour a day for reading and math into, specialized instruction. And sometimes that can be embedded in the general classroom as well. If a child is enrolled in a charter public school, or if a child is enrolled in a private school by their parent, not by the IEP team, but by their parent outside of the process, there are some different rules in those cases. And so you can read about those in that Steps in the Special Education Process brochure.
And then you monitor. Having a great IEP and having a great educational program is fabulous, but you still want to know if it's working, or if perhaps there are some areas that need to be tweaked. So at least once a year you will get together and review that IEP and then develop one for the next year. And in the IEP, parents are informed of their child's progress, including that statement of, is progress sufficient to achieve the goal by the end of the year? That's one kind of monitoring. Parents monitor as well as teachers. When your kids bring papers home, they bring notes from the teacher home, if you look at them, you're monitoring. And so just consider all that information as your input that you can use in framing your decisions about what you think your child needs. Reevaluations are done at least once every 3 years, but remember, if you have some concerns and you think the evaluations that were done a couple of years ago are no longer giving you the information you need to make decisions, you can ask for reevaluations to be done sooner. Most often in this process, things work well. There are always areas where people have some discussions, sometimes some intense discussions on why do you think that would work? Why do you think that wouldn't work? Why do you have those concerns? And informal extra meetings, sharing more information usually works. But if it doesn't, if you really get to a point where the parent and the school district cannot reach agreement, there are some formal dispute resolution options and some that are less formal that the Department of Education offers as a way to resolve those disputes. When you are monitoring, keeping copies of report cards, progress reports, dated work samples in a nice organized format is a good way to do that. Sometimes kids have behavioral challenges, and when they do, they may even be suspended or get an in-school suspension or detention, and you'll get a discipline report for that. Keep track of those as well. And you have a form that we've provided in your material, because once a child with a disability is suspended for 10 days in a school year, and it might be 2 days here, 2 days here, when it adds up to 10 days total, at that point, that child is entitled to services for any extra days they're suspended. And having that information also, keeping track of it, is a good way to say, we're seeing kind of a pattern here of certain behaviors that are in situations that are posing a problem for this child. Perhaps we should ask for a functional behavioral assessment to be done so that we can figure out what is going on and how can we better meet that child's needs so they don't need to rely on negative behaviors to have their needs addressed appropriately. Any questions?
So, well, first of all, that was a lot, and it was really information packed. I just want to remind folks, if you have a question that's been on your mind, the way to submit it to us over the next couple of minutes is through the Q&A feature on the Zoom webinar platform. You just have to move your mouse around until your menu pops up, your toolbar pops up, hit the Q&A, and then type your question and hit submit. So a few things sort of come to mind for me, Bonnie,
Sure.
which I think, I'm sort of putting myself in the shoes of somebody who's going through this for the first time.
Okay.
Let's say you get through the process and everybody sort of agrees to this plan.
Yeah.
And 3 months later you go, wow, I'm just not seeing this working. Is there a process to amend the IEP during the school year?
You can ask for a meeting, and again, I recommend doing everything in writing, and so Parent Information Center has a sample letter that you can use to request evaluations, to make a referral, and to request a team meeting. So you could use that sample letter, or you could make your own, and you write to the school district and say, I am requesting an IEP team meeting. because I have concerns. You may even detail them in your letter so that people can prepare for that meeting better. And as a courtesy, it's just always a good idea to say, here are some dates and times when it would be convenient for me to meet. And it may be every day after any day after 2 o'clock, or any Tuesday or Thursday. And that enables the team, when they're preparing to schedule a meeting, to pick a date that's going to work best. Because when a meeting is scheduled, you'll get an invitation or a notice of that meeting, and it will say the date, time, and place where the meeting is being held, the purpose, and who will be there. But if you get that notice and that's a time when you can't be there, you can ask for the meeting to be scheduled at a different time so that you can be there. But if you are asking for a meeting to be scheduled, you wouldn't want to have to put the school in a position of picking a date and then you saying, no, that doesn't work for me. Just providing that information ahead of time is courteous. And then when that meeting is scheduled, then you can say, here's some issues that I'm seeing. Here's some areas that we thought would work, but they're not working as well. And then you can make those changes in the IEP. It can be amended at any time.
And, you know, I think for some folks too, coming into this process, if you're not in the habit of writing down goals that are specific to people's education, right? So, you know, I'll just, you know, I'll pick an example out of thin air. Okay, so let's say for the first time, you know, a parent comes in and says, you know, my goal is for my child to, you know, have an enjoyable experience during the school day and to be able to relate to friends. There may be many other things that my child needs assistance with academically, but I'm not versed in what the academic world is all about. And so how do I help to identify goals that are appropriate to my child's education, you know, that I can bring to that first IEP meeting?
In that case, that's one example of why it is really nice that you're not the only one on the team, that there are people there with expertise in the areas of reading and math and speech and language and so on. You know, I knew when my child was little that his articulation wasn't great, but you know, that he struggled to have people understand him, especially people who didn't know him well. But I had no idea if children make a B sound or a P sound or a TH sound first, at what age certain things were appropriate, and at what age, developmental age, should a child be able to make certain sounds more clearly. And that's where I relied on the speech and language specialist to be able to say that. To give that information. And so I could raise a concern, which is when we go out and my child is interacting with other kids in the neighborhood, or, you know, I'm hearing from parents of other kids in this class, they can't understand what he's saying. And then ask, how can we address that? And then others on the team can then bring that forward. In terms of academics, it might be helpful to say, what do you expect? What are the expectations for a first grader? What kinds of things should a first grader be expected to know by the end of first grade? Or for preschoolers, what do 3-year-olds typically do in terms of their pre-reading skills and different areas? Because many generations ago, people had a dozen kids pretty regularly, and nowadays you might have one child, and so you don't even have anybody to compare your child's development with, and to know whether or not, is this unusual? Is this progress what we should be expecting, or is this an area where my child is really struggling and needs some special help? And so you can ask others on the team for that input. You also can ask other parents. You know, if you belong to a parent group, and many school districts have them, and sometimes for certain disability categories, there may be, for example, there may be a statewide Down syndrome organization where parents can get together and share ideas and information, or there may be others, or you could even start one. And then you can share and brainstorm together. Here are some issues my child is having. Are any of you seeing that? What kinds of things did you do to or ask for? What worked for your child? I never wanted to have to be the one making all of the mistakes for my child. I prefer to learn from other people, and by asking questions of other families, you get that opportunity.
Yeah, that's really sound advice.
Yeah.
And I think again, when you're new into this world, it's, you know, sometimes you feel like you got to go it alone until you realize, oh geez, someone else has been already walking on this path. So maybe they can toss a few breadcrumbs, you know, so I can find my way too.
And 1 out of every 7 kids in school gets some kind of special assistance. And so you are not a member of a really unique club, that there are lots of other people who have done this and who have found it equally overwhelming at different times. And so if you feel alone, reach out.
You know, in addition to sort of what I would consider the more informal networks, you know, where can people get information about how to write a measurable goal, or, you know, are there IEP coaches for parents?
That's a really hard question, because for every single child, the needs and what works and what doesn't work, what approaches seem best is going to be different. You can get some ideas from other people, but we have some materials on our website that can give some information, but it really is what I found helpful to say at the end of the year, what worked well, and so I would know what we want to do more of, and what didn't work well, so I would stop doing those. When the school district proposes a goal or a short-term objective, and you look at it and you say to yourself, how will we know if this is working? Is this measurable? Then, and if you find if it's not clearly understandable to you, you're probably not the only one on that team who is not really understanding it as clearly. And so ask questions and just say, could we give examples? You know, could you explain that more? When you're writing that goal, could you give some examples in there? Because I just want to make sure that I understand it.
Great. Well, that's really helpful. And Bonnie, I say that we're we're at the end of our time, but I want to really thank you for sharing all this with our attendees today. And for those of you who are our attendees, I just want to remind you that we will be sending out a survey to you, so you can help us again identify topics for future webinars, or let us know how this experience was for you today. We will be uploading this through YouTube. There'll be a link on our site within the next week. So if folks have others that you want to share this information with, you can certainly point them to our website at csni.org. So they can get this information as well. And I know the Parent Information Center is a wealth of resources as well.
Lots of workshops, and you may have heard this, and it was relatively quick because we had an hour, but you can listen to it again once it's uploaded, and then things will make a little bit more sense perhaps if something seemed a little bit overwhelming.
All right. Absolutely. Well, again, thanks, Bonnie, and thank you all for signing in today. Stay tuned for information on our next webinar, and unfortunately, I don't know what it is, so I can't share it with you today.
They're going to tell you.
Yeah, that's right. I hope that you'll tell us. So again, thanks everybody, and safe travels out there.